Some women are raised to be given away, handed from a father to a husband like a parcel that must not be dropped, taught from the cradle that their worth is measured by how quietly they go. So when a man finally opens a door and tells such a woman that she is free to walk through it, she does not believe him. She looks for the trap. Lynette Selby was sold to settle a dead man's debts. She was married to a duke the whole of England called a murderer, a man rumored to bury his wives beneath the black water of his own moor. She climbed into his carriage, expecting a cold bed and a colder master. Instead, on their wedding night, he leaned close, and in a voice worn down to little more than breath, he whispered that she might leave if she wished. She stayed, and everything changed. The carriage that came for Lynette Selby was black as a hearse, and very nearly as silent. It arrived at the gates of Thornley a little after dawn, drawn by 4 gray horses steaming in the cold, and there was no crest upon the door. She had expected a crest. A duke who wished the world to know his business would have painted his arms across the panel in gold. This man had left the wood bare and polished, as though he did not care to be recognized upon the road, or did not wish to be. She understood the wish. She had spent the better part of a year trying to become invisible. Lynette was 23, and she wore gray because she owned nothing that was not black, and had grown tired of black. Her eyes were a pale and steady gray that made strangers uneasy, because she looked at them a beat too long and did not look away first. She had a way of standing very still that people mistook for meekness. It was not meekness. It was the stillness of a woman who had learned that motion drew attention, and attention had never once done her any good. She let the groom hand her up into the carriage. She did not look back at the house. Thornley had been her father's, a low gray manor with a stable yard larger than its hall, for Roland Selby had cared a great deal more for horses than for men. He had bred them, hunters mostly, and a line of blood mares so fine that an earl had once ridden 2 days through foul weather simply to stand in the paddock and look. Lynette had been raised in that paddock. She had sat a horse before she could properly walk, had learned the language of ears and withers, and the whites of eyes before she learned her letters, and by 15, there was not a green colt in the county her father would trust to another hand. She could stand in a loose box with a stallion that had savaged 2 men and walk out an hour later with the animal following her like a lamb. It was the one true thing she owned, and it could not be sold, and it could not be taxed, and Josiah Krell could not take it from her, though God knew he had taken all the rest. Her father had died in the spring, of a failure of the heart the physician swore was natural, and that Lynette believed was simply grief wearing the body out. The stud had been failing 3 years by then. A bad season, a worse one, a lawsuit lost, a partner who proved a thief, and then the notes came due all at once, the way debts always do, in a flock, like crows to a fallen thing. And every last one of them, she learned at the reading of the will, had found its way into the hands of a single man. Josiah Krell had begun as a corn factor and made himself rich in the war. Feeding the army at prices an unkind newspaper had later called a species of legal robbery. What he wanted now, more than money, of which he had a vulgar sufficiency, was to be a man whom other men could not refuse. He had come to Thornley in June, sat in her dead father's chair, and refused the tea. "I hold everything," he had told her, folding his soft white hands upon the table. "The mortgage upon the house, the notes upon the land. Every farthing your father owed, I own." He had smiled then, and it was the smile that Lynette remembered, because it did not reach the flat brown coins of his eyes. "I am not a hard man, Miss Selby. I would see you settled. A woman of your sense would do very well as mistress of my house." He had a wife, of course. She was in poor health. He had said the words in poor health, the way another man might say, nearly ripe. And there was Wren. Wren was 15, and everything Linnet was not. All quickness and color and laughter. A girl who sang without knowing it and cried at the deaths of birds. When Krell spoke of the family being settled, his eyes had moved just once to the doorway where Wren stood. And in that single glance, Linnet had understood the whole shape of the thing. A penniless beauty of 15 with no name left to protect her was not a person in the eyes of the world. She was an opportunity, and Krell would see to her settling too, in time, one way or another, and Linnet would have no power on earth to stop him. So she had begun to look for a door. Any door. She had written to every relation her father possessed, and the few there were answered with the particular warmth of people afraid of being asked for money. She had inquired after positions as a governess, and been told, kindly, that a young woman from a family in scandalous debt was not the sort one wished near one's children. There was no arrangement of the figures, however clever, that did not end with Krell holding them all in his soft white hands. And then, in the last week of August, a different carriage had come, and a lawyer had climbed out of it, and he had laid a proposal upon the table that was so strange, Linnet had made him say it twice. His client, the lawyer said, a gentleman of the first rank whom he was not at liberty to name until certain matters were agreed, wished to make Miss Selby an offer of marriage. His client would discharge, at once and entirely, every debt encumbering Thornley. His client would settle upon Miss Wren Selby £4,000 in trust, hers absolutely upon her majority or her marriage, beyond the reach of any creditor living. In return, Miss Selby would travel north, become his wife, and ask no questions about the household she was entering until she had entered it. Linnet had sat very still. "Your client," she had said. "Name him." The lawyer had hesitated, and then, because she had gone on looking at him a beat too long, he had told her. His client was Ambrose Vane, the 4th Duke of Blackmere. She had heard the name, of course. Everyone had. It was the sort of name mothers used to frighten daughters, whispered behind fans, in rooms Linnet had never been grand enough to enter. The Duke of Blackmere had married young, a bride of great beauty and greater fortune, and within 3 years the young Duchess was dead, and no one had ever satisfactorily said of what. Some said a fever. Some said a fall. The unkindest said the black tarn below the house, into which, they murmured, more than one thing had gone that was never meant to come up again. The Duke had shut his gates upon the world, and not opened them since. He turned away callers, refused every invitation, and had once set his horse at a magistrate who came to the door with questions. He was scarred, they said, though no two accounts agreed upon where. He was mad, they said. He was cruel. He buried his wives beneath the water and mourned none of them, and he wished to marry Linnet Selby, a bankrupt horse breeder's daughter he had never met, and pay a fortune for the privilege, and he would not say why. A wiser woman, perhaps, would have refused, but Linnet had learned to read a bargain the way her father read a horse, by the small, honest signs beneath the surface, and she turned the offer over all that long night, looking for the trap. There was always a trap. Yet when she weighed the Duke's, whatever it might prove to be, against the one she already stood in, the arithmetic came out only one way. Krell offered a soft white hand and a lifetime of being owned. The Duke offered £4,000, set beyond all reach, in Wren's name, in iron trust, and he had bound the girl's safety into the very first line of the bargain, before asking anything at all. A cruel man does not do that. A cruel man keeps the girl as leverage. So there was one thing she knew of the Duke before ever she saw his face. Whatever he wanted from her, he did not want it enough to use her sister to get it. It was not love, nor even kindness, but it was a line drawn, and she had lived long enough among people who drew no lines at all to know the worth of one. She had signed the settlement in September, her name small and certain at the bottom. She made the lawyer add one clause of her own devising, that the £4,000 should pass to Wren, whole and untouched, even if Lynette herself should die within the year. And he had looked at her strangely and written it down. That morning she had held Wren in the cold hall while the black carriage waited, and told her sister she was going north to be a duchess, and smiled while she said it, so the girl would remember it as a triumph and not a sacrifice. Now, the house and the South were behind her, and for 3 days the carriage had carried her up into a country that grew barer and colder with every mile, until the hedgerows gave way to stone walls, and the walls gave way to open moor, brown and endless, and combed flat by a wind that never stopped. On the third evening, the road climbed a long ridge, and at the top of it, the driver drew the horses to a halt without being asked, as though even he required a moment. Lynette wiped the glass with the heel of her glove and looked down. Below her, the moor fell away into a shallow black valley, and at the bottom of the valley lay a sheet of water, so still and so dark that it did not shine. It swallowed, giving nothing back to the last of the light. And on the near shore of that water, grown up out of the rock as though it had never been built, but had simply always been, crouched a great gray house with 100 blind windows, and not one single lamp lit in any of them. Blackmere. She sat and looked at it a long moment, and she could not tell, for the life of her, whether she was looking at her rescue or at her grave, and the not knowing settled into her chest and stayed there, cold as the water below. Then the driver clicked to the horses, and the black carriage started down. The door of Blackmere Hall opened before Lynette had climbed the steps, which meant that someone had been watching the road. A woman stood in the gap, perhaps 60, upright as a fire iron, in gray wool and a white cap so severely starched it might have cut bread. She held a single candle, though the hall behind her yawned into a darkness one candle could not hope to trouble. Her face had been arranged, long ago and permanently, into patient disapproval, as though she had expected the worst of the world for so many years, that its arrival now brought her no surprise, only a grim and quiet vindication. She looked at Lynette's gray traveling dress, at the single small trunk the driver set upon the step, and last and longest at Lynette's face. Whatever she had expected to find written there, she did not find it, and her mouth tightened by a fraction. "You will be Miss Selby," she said. It was not a welcome, it was a verdict. "I am," Lynette said. "And you are?" "Mrs. Prewitt. I keep His Grace's house." The woman did not move from the doorway. "His Grace does not receive visitors." "I'm not a visitor," Lynette said. She was cold to the bone, and had passed some hours ago the point at which she had strength to spare for fear. "I am to be married here tonight. That makes me rather more than a visitor. It makes me, I am given to understand, the mistress of this house." She let the words sit in the freezing air. "Though if you would prefer I go on standing upon the step until I freeze to it, I am sure the wedding can be conducted around my corpse. It would suit the reputation of the place." For one long breath, Mrs. Prewitt said nothing at all. Then something moved at the very back of her eyes that was not quite approval, but was perhaps its distant northern cousin, and she stepped aside. "Come in then," she said, "and stop letting the cold in. His Grace hates the cold." Lynette stepped over the threshold of Blackmere Hall, and the great door swung shut behind her, with a sound like a closing tomb, and shut the moor and the last of the daylight out. Inside, the house was all shadow and stone, and the smell of old smoke and older damp. Mrs. Prewitt went ahead with her one candle, and by its swaying light, Linnet caught the hall in pieces, a suit of black armor in a corner, a staircase wide enough to drive a cart up, a cavernous fireplace with no fire in it. On the broad landing where the stair turned hung something very large beneath a sheet of Holland cloth, a portrait by its shape, tall as a man and twice as wide, shrouded so completely that not an inch of the frame showed. Linnet slowed beneath it. The cloth stirred, very faintly, in a draught she could not feel. "That way is shut," said Mrs. Prewitt, without turning, without being asked, as Linnet's glance moved toward a corridor that branched away east into deeper dark. "The whole east wing is shut and stays shut. You have no cause to go there, and you will not." Linnet said nothing, and filed the sentence away with the others. They had reached the foot of a second, meaner stair when the sound came. It rose from somewhere behind the house, from the stable yard, and it froze Linnet with her hand upon the cold rail. A scream, high and tearing, of pure animal fury, and after it, a splintering crash of hooves against timber, and a man shouting, and another crash, and then a silence somehow worse than either. Linnet's whole body had turned toward it before she knew she had moved. That was no ordinary horse. She knew the difference in her blood. That was a creature past reason and past fear, a thing gone dangerous, the sound her father had taught her to run toward and never from. Mrs. Prewitt had gone very still, and her candle flame stood straight and small in the dark. "You'll keep away from the west stalls," she said, and for the first time her flat voice held something underneath it. "That is not your affair. That is nobody's affair now." She turned the candle upon Linnet's face, and her old eyes were hard. "There are 3 things you are to leave alone in this house, Miss Selby, if you mean to be happy here, and I will name them but the once: the east wing, the horse, and any question that begins with the word how." Somewhere far above them, then, so faint that Linnet was never afterward certain she had truly heard it, a child laughed. It was there and gone, a single bright thread of sound in all that stone dark. And then a door closed somewhere high in the house, softly, and the laughter did not come again. Linnet looked up into the darkness at the top of the stair, then at Mrs. Prewitt, whose face had shut like a fist. "There is no child in this house," Mrs. Prewitt said, before Linnet had asked. And her saying so, when Linnet had asked nothing at all, told Linnet more than any answer could have. "Come," the housekeeper said. "His Grace is waiting. He has waited long enough." She set her hand to a pair of tall doors at the end of the passage, and she pushed them open, and she stood aside. And Linnet Selby saw, for the first time, the man she had crossed the whole of England to marry. The man who rose from the chair beside the dead hearth was not the monster the whispers had promised, and that was somehow worse, because a monster she would have known how to meet. He was tall, and lean in the way of a man who had stopped troubling to eat, and his dark hair had gone gray at the temples, a decade too soon. His face had been handsome once. She could see the ruin of the handsomeness in it still, the way you can see the shape of a fine house in a burned one. But what held her eyes upon the threshold, though she knew it uncivil to stare, was his throat. A thick, pale scar ran across the front of it from below one ear nearly to the other, old and badly healed, a wound no man had any business surviving. "Miss Selby," he said. His voice was the second wound. It came out low and torn, a rasp that barely carried across the room, each word shaped with visible care, as though speech were a labor he had learned again from the beginning. She understood then why the county thought him silent. He was not silent. He had been left with a voice that cost him to use, and a man who must pay for every word learns very quickly to say few. "Your Grace," she answered, and curtsied. He looked at her a long moment, and she made herself be looked at, standing still under it, as she had learned to stand still under everything. She saw him find, as Mrs. Pruitt had found, that she was not weeping and not trembling and not what he had expected. Something in him eased by a fraction. Something else grew more wary. "The vicar is waiting," he said. "There is no cause to make him wait longer." "Unless you have changed your mind. You may still change your mind, Miss Selby. There is a carriage." "I have not changed my mind," she said. "Then let us be married," said the Duke of Blackmere, as another man might have said, "Let us have it over with," and he offered her his arm. They were wed within the half-hour in the cold stone chapel at the edge of the East Garden, by the light of 6 candles, and no more. The vicar was a thin, frightened man who would not look the Duke in the face. Mrs. Pruitt stood as one witness. A broad, silent man, the housekeeper named as Balfour, the head groom, stood as the other. There were no flowers, and no music but the wind at the leads. The Duke made his vows in that torn whisper, and because it cost him so, Lynette found, she listened to each word as though it were the only word in the world. When her own turn came, she spoke clearly, so that her voice should carry for them both, and she felt his eyes come to her, quick and surprised. He had expected her to whisper, too. He had expected her to be ashamed. The vicar pronounced them man and wife. The Duke did not kiss her. He took her cold hand in his colder one and held it a moment, and let it go. "It is done," he said. "I thank you." And that was her wedding. Mrs. Pruitt showed her afterward to a chamber in the west front, warmer than any room she had yet seen, with a fire actually burning in the grate, and the bed turned down. Lynette stood in the middle of it when the housekeeper had gone, and waited for her heart to slow, and didn't let herself sit. She was a wife now, and she knew what manner of man the world said she had married. She had decided on the long road north that she would not fight and would not weep, that she would meet whatever came with her eyes open, because a woman with her eyes open at least keeps her dignity. So when the soft knock came at the door between her room and the next, she was standing and composed and ready. "Come in," she said. The Duke came in. He had taken off his coat, and in his shirt sleeves he looked less a duke than a tired man, the scar showing plainer above his open collar. He did not come near her. He stopped just inside the door and looked at her, braced there in the firelight, and something crossed his ruined face that she could not read. "You are frightened," he said. "I am not," she lied. "You are," he whispered, "and you are right to be, if the half of what they say of me were true." He drew a breath that seemed to cost him. "It is not true. But you have no way to know that tonight, and I will not ask you to take it on faith. So listen to me, Lynette. Listen." She listened. "The settlement is complete," he said. It was complete the moment the vicar spoke. "Your sister's money is hers, in trust, beyond my reach and beyond any man's, whatever becomes of you or of me. You have done everything I required of you. You did it when you stood in that chapel. There is nothing further you are obliged to give me. Do you understand what I am telling you?" "No," she said honestly. "I am telling you that you are free. You may stay in this house, or you may not. There is a dower house at the far end of the park, where you might live as you please, and see nothing of me. Or I will settle an income on you, and you may go where you like, to town, to the sea, abroad. I ask only that you keep my name, for reasons of my own that are no fault of yours. Beyond that," he stopped. "Beyond that, you owe me nothing. Not your company. Not your bed. Nothing." The fire cracked. Far off in the house a door closed. "You may leave if you wish," the Duke whispered. Tonight, tomorrow, whenever you like. The carriage will always be ready. No one will stop you. I will not stop you." Lynette stood very still. She had braced herself against cruelty and had no defense at all prepared for this. All her life she had been handed from one keeping to another, a thing that belonged wherever it was put, and no one had ever once told her that the door was hers to walk through. A woman raised to be given away does not trust a man who tries to give her back to herself. She looked for the trick in it. She looked hard and could not find one. "Why," she said at last, "why marry a woman only to tell her she may leave you on the very night you wed her? What kind of man does that?" The Duke was quiet a moment. "The kind," he said, "who has watched this house close over a woman once already, and swore he would not do it a second time. Do not ask me more than that tonight. You may ask me almost anything, in time, and I will answer it. But not how. Never how. That door stays shut. The same 3 rules. The east wing, the horse, the word, how." She heard Mrs. Prewitt's flat voice beneath his broken one, and understood that the rules were not the housekeeper's at all. They were his. And there it was, the shape of him, plain at last. Not a monster. A man walled up alive in his own grief, who had built a prison so careful that he had thought to leave the door standing open for everyone in it but himself. She could take the dower house. She could take the income and the sea and be a duchess in name in some bright town far from this cold water. And it would be the wise thing, and the safe thing, and the sensible thing. She thought of the child she had heard laughing. She thought of the horse screaming in the dark. She thought that she had spent the whole of her life being useful only to horses, and useless, so far as the world had ever troubled to notice, to everyone else, a clever woman whom no one had once needed, and that here in this ruined house was a man who whispered, and a child no one would own to, and a creature past saving in the west stalls, and every one of them was drowning quietly in the same black water, and not one of them would say the word, how. "I will stay," Lynette said. The Duke went very still. "You did not hear me," he whispered. "I said you are free. I heard you. I have listened to every word you have paid so dearly to say." She lifted her chin. "You have given me a door, Your Grace, and I thank you for it more than you know, for it is the first anyone has troubled to give me. But a door is worth nothing unless the choosing is mine, and I choose to stay." He held her gaze a long time, and the wariness in his face cracked, and beneath it she saw something raw and almost afraid, the look of a man who had braced himself for solitude and been handed company instead, and didn't know what to do with it. "Then stay," he said at last, so low she barely caught it. "God help you. Stay." He inclined his head and went back through the door between their rooms and closed it, and she heard the key turn in the lock on his side, not on hers, as though it were himself he did not trust. Lynette stood alone in the firelight a while. Then she did what she had already decided upon somewhere in the middle of his broken speech. She took up her candle and opened her own door, which was not locked, and stepped out into the dark and sleeping house to find the child that everyone swore wasn't there. She found the child by following the cold. The warm rooms were all in the west front. Everywhere else the house grew colder as she climbed, and the coldest air of all came sliding down a narrow back stair at the very top, and Lynette went up it, because in her experience, the thing a house most wished to hide was always kept where the fires were meanest. At the top stood a door ajar, with a thin line of candlelight beneath it. She pushed it open. A small fire burned low in a nursery grate. In a chair beside it, a plain, tired woman slept sitting up with her knitting fallen into her lap. And at the window, in a white nightgown, her breath fogging the black glass, stood a little girl of perhaps 6 years, looking down at the moon on the water. The child turned. She was not frightened. She looked at Lynette with a calm, grave, considering directness, so exactly the Duke's own that the question of her parentage answered itself in an instant, whatever the world preferred to whisper. "Are you the new one?" the child said. "I suppose I am," Lynette said. "What is your name?" "Oh, Tilly," said the child, "but nobody calls me it. Papa calls me Tilly." She tilted her head. "You are not supposed to be here. Nobody is supposed to know about me." She said it without self-pity, as a plain fact of her small life, the way another child might say, "We are not to run on the stairs. They want to take me away, so I have to be a secret." "Are you going to take me away?" "No," Lynette said, and found that she meant it with a fierceness that surprised her. "Come away from the cold glass, Tilly. Your feet must be frozen." And the child, who had been kept a secret in the top of a cold house by people who loved her badly and clumsily and only knew how to hide her, crossed the room at once and put her frozen hand into the hand of a stranger, because a stranger had told her to come away from the cold. Something in Lynette's chest, long shut, cracked quietly open. She was still there when the gray light came, sitting on the end of the child's bed, and that was where the Duke found her. He stopped in the doorway. His face, in the dawn, was terrible, and Lynette rose at once to meet whatever was coming, for she had broken his first rule on her first night and expected to be sent from the house before breakfast. But the terror in his face, she saw, was not anger. It was fear. He looked from her to the sleeping child and back, and his broken voice, when it came, shook. "You are not to know of her," he whispered. "No one is to know of her." "I know of her now," Lynette said quietly, "and I am not going to tell anyone. Sit down, Your Grace. You look as though you have not slept, and I think it is time you told me what I have married into. All of it. You promised me any question but one. I am asking." And because he was exhausted, and because she had spent the night guarding his daughter without being asked, the Duke of Blackmere sat down on a nursery chair too small for him and told her. Ottilie was his. Whatever the county said, whatever his cousin swore before whatever court would listen, the child was his own, and he would put any man in the ground who said otherwise. Her mother, the first Duchess, had died when Tilly was not yet 2, and the manner of that death was the one door that stayed shut, and he begged her, in that ruined whisper, not to try it. Not yet. Lynette did not. But there was a cousin, he said. Gideon Vane, a cool, pleasant, patient man, the next male heir, for the title could pass only through a son, and Ambrose had no son, and would get none. Gideon had wanted Blackmere all his life, and could not have the title while Ambrose lived, but had found another road to the same country. For 3 years, he had been quietly petitioning, gathering physicians willing to swear, gathering neighbors willing to whisper, building a case that the Duke of Blackmere was mad and dangerous and unfit, a recluse who had done away with one wife and kept a hidden child in a tower, and that in mercy, the estate and the guardianship of the little girl ought to be placed in the steady hands of his nearest sane relation. Himself. If he wins, Ambrose whispered, he takes the estate to manage until my death, which he will then be in no hurry to postpone. And he takes Tilly, to raise, to marry off in 12 years to whatever purpose suits him. He looked at Lynette with his hollow eyes. A madman alone in a ruin with a secret child is precisely the picture he has been painting. But a madman does not have a duchess. A ruin is not a ruin if there is a sane and capable woman running it, receiving callers, sitting in the family pew. That is what I married. Not a wife. A witness, Proof that this house is a house, and not a grave. He said it flatly, without apology, laying the whole cold machinery of it before her because she had asked for all of it. I'm sorry. It is not a pretty thing to have been bought for. Lynette was quiet a moment, turning it over the way she turned over everything, looking not for the insult in it, but for the truth. No, she agreed at last. It is not pretty. But it is honest, and you have told it to me plainly, and that is worth more to me than pretty has ever been. She stood. Then here is my answer, your grace, and you may rely upon it as you would rely upon a signed bond. I will be your duchess in every way the world can see. I will run this house until it shines. I will receive your cousin when he comes, and I will smile at him over the good silver. And Tilly. She looked at the sleeping child. Tilly is not a secret any longer. Not from me. She is mine to guard now, as much as yours. And no cool, pleasant man is going to carry her out of this house while I am standing in it. The Duke looked at her, as though she had spoken in a language he had long ago stopped hoping to hear. They came out of the nursery that morning, allies, which is a colder word than friends, and a far stronger one, and Lynette did not know yet that it was the first stone of something neither of them had the courage to name. She knew only that a battle had a shape now, and an enemy had a name, and that she, who had been given nothing to do for 10 long years, had at last been given something worth doing. The letter came a fortnight later. Balfour brought it up from the village himself, his broad face grim, and the Duke read it standing at the window and then set it down very carefully, as a man sets down something he would rather have thrown. He's coming, Ambrose whispered. Gideon. He writes that he means to call upon us, to pay his respects to the new Duchess. He looked at Lynette. He is coming to see whether you are real. Then let us be certain, Lynette said, that he finds me very real indeed. The weeks before the cousin came were, though Lynette would only understand it much later, the happiest of her life to that hour. She took the house in hand, the way her father had taught her to take a nervous colt, without sudden movements, and without asking permission she did not need. She had the shrouded portrait on the stair, left shrouded, for she was in no hurry to trespass on a grief she did not yet understand. But she had the fires lit in the dead grates, and the Holland covers pulled from the good rooms, and the long dining table polished until the candle flames swam in it. Mrs. Prewitt watched all this with her mouth in its accustomed flat line, and thawed by degrees so small that no single one of them could be caught, until one morning Lynette realized the old woman had begun, without a word, to bring her the household keys each dawn and take her orders for the day. Tilly came down from the tower. That was the change Lynette was proudest of. The child ate her breakfast now, in the small parlor with the grown people, and rode a fat pony on a leading rein around the walled garden, while Lynette walked at her head, and laughed the bright laugh Lynette had heard on her first night, and had been told did not exist. The Duke would find excuses to be at the window when his daughter laughed. He thought no one saw him do it. Lynette saw. And in all that time, 3 things stayed as they were. The east wing stayed shut. The word how went unspoken. And in the west stalls, past the tidy loose boxes where the carriage greys stood placid, something waited in the dark that the whole household stepped around, as one steps around a grave. She had the story from Balfour in the end, because she asked him plainly, and because he had come to trust her about the horses in the way of men who love animals recognizing one another. He was her Grace's, the head groom said, low, not meeting her eye. The first one, a black stallion, 16 hands and a devil in him even then, but she could ride him like sitting in a chair. God rest her. Vesper, she called him. After he stopped. After it happened, the horse went wrong. Wouldn't it be handled? Struck out. He broke Tom Ackroydis' arm in 2 places, and near took the face off a lad from the village, and his grace gave the order he was to be kept, and fed, and never sold, and never put down, and never rode, and the door kept bolted, and that is how it has been these 4 years. He looked at her at last, and there was a plea in it. Doan't go into him, your grace. Beg pardon, but doan't. He's not a horse any more. He's a grief with hooves on. There is no gentling that. Linnet thanked him and did not promise. She went that evening, when the yard was empty and the light going blue over the moor. The stall was at the dark end, double bolted, the top door shut fast, though every other horse looked over its half door into the passage. When she drew the upper bolt and eased the door open a hand's width, the smell came out first, of a beast kept too long in the dark, and then a stillness that was worse than any noise, the coiled stillness of a thing deciding whether to kill. 2 eyes caught the last light and threw it back, white-rimmed, enormous. Linnet did not go in. Her father had not raised a fool. She sat down on an upturned pail in the passage, just beyond the door, with her hands loose in her lap, and she began to talk. She talked of nothing, of the weather, of the fat pony, of Tilly's lessons, of the price of oats, in the low, endless, unbothered voice her father had used on ruined horses, the voice that promised nothing and asked for nothing, and simply went on being calm in the dark, until calm began to seem, to the animal, like a thing that might be safe to try. The stallion screamed once and flung himself at the wall, and the whole row of boxes shook. Linnet did not stop talking. She did not flinch. She had been screamed at and struck at by things far crueler than any horse, and she had learned long ago that the one power a frightened creature could not stand against was a person who would simply, quietly, refuse to leave. She came the next evening, and the next. On the 4th, the stallion did not scream. On the 6th, he came to the front of the box and stood, trembling, his ears going back and forward, listening to the price of oats. On the 9th evening, Linnet rose from her pail, still talking, and stood in the open door, and put out one flat, empty hand, palm up, and asked nothing at all. She did not hear the Duke come into the yard behind her. She learned afterward that he had come looking for her, and had seen the bolt drawn and the door open, and had understood in one lurch of pure terror exactly what she was doing, and had opened his mouth to shout, to order her back, to save her, and had stopped, because the black stallion Vesper, who had not let a living soul touch him in 4 years, who had broken a man's arm and been left to rot in the dark rather than face the shot he was owed, had lowered his great ruined head and stretched out his neck and laid his soft muzzle into the palm of the new Duchess's hand. Neither of them moved. The horse breathed against her fingers. Linnet stood in the doorway with tears standing in her eyes that she had not given it leave to shed, and stroked, very slowly, the velvet nose of her husband's dead wife's horse, and murmured to it that it was a good boy, that it had always been a good boy, that no one was going to hurt it now. When at last she stepped back and bolted the door, gently, and turned, she found the Duke of Blackmere standing motionless in the middle of the yard with his face wet. "You gentled him," he whispered. It was not a question. His voice had gone to almost nothing. 4 years, 4 physicians could do nothing for me, and a churchyard full of prayers did nothing for her, and you sat on a pail and talked to him about oats, and you gentled him. He had a good deal wrong with him, Linnet said, her own voice unsteady, but nothing that couldn't stand to be waited out. Most things can be waited out, Your Grace, if a body is only stubborn enough to stay. She had not meant it to mean more than it said. But she saw the words go into him, stubborn enough to stay, and she saw him understand that she had said the same to him in his firelit doorway on their wedding night, and had been proving it every day since, quietly, to the whole broken household, in the only language she had ever fully trusted. He crossed the yard to her. He stopped closer than he had ever stood, close enough that she had to tip her head to hold his eyes, and for one long moment in the blue dark, she thought that the walled-up man was going to reach for her, and found that she was not afraid of it at all, and that the not being afraid was itself a kind of falling. Then hooves sounded on the drive, not the wild hooves of the stall. The brisk, ordinary iron ring of a good carriage team coming up the gravel at speed, in the dark, uninvited, a full day before any decent guest would arrive. A coachman's voice called the horses down. A door opened somewhere at the front of the house, and Mrs. Prewitt's raised voice carried thin across the yard, and under it, pleasant and cool and carrying, a man's easy laugh. The Duke's face changed. Every soft thing went out of it, and the walls came back up, stone on stone. "He is early," Ambrose whispered. "Of course he is early. He wished to catch us unready." He looked at Linnet, and something in his eyes now was almost desperate. Gideon is here. Gideon Vane was the most dangerous kind of man, which is to say, a pleasant one. He came into the hall shaking the cold from a coat of excellent cut, smiling, his fair hair unruffled, his color good, and where Ambrose was all raw edges and ruin, his cousin was smooth as a river stone that the water has been years wearing down. He was perhaps 35, handsome in a mild, forgettable way, and he had a trick of seeming delighted by everything he saw, which Linnet understood within the first minute to be the way he took inventory. "Cousin," he said warmly, crossing to grip Ambrose by both arms, before the Duke could prevent it. His eyes went to the scarred throat, to the shadows under the eyes, and filled with a tender concern so perfectly performed that Linnet nearly admired it. "You look tired. You look so very tired. We worry for you, you know. All of us." He turned the smile upon Linnet. "And this must be the bride the whole North is talking of." "The Duchess of Blackmere," Linnet said, and gave him her hand, and let him bow over it, and smiled back at him with an equal and answering warmth that gave away exactly nothing. "You find us unprepared, Mr. Vane. We had looked for you tomorrow. But you are family, and family need never stand on ceremony. You will take some refreshment after such a cold road." She saw the small flicker in his eyes, the first faint recalibration. He had come a day early precisely to find a madhouse caught unawares, a cold hearth, a cowering child, a duke raving. He had found instead a warm, ordered hall, a gracious wife, and a table that, within 20 minutes, bore tea and seed cake and cold fowl, as though it had all been waiting for him. He stayed 4 hours, and Linnet fought him for every one of them, and he never once knew they were fighting. He asked gently after the Duke's health, and Linnet answered that his Grace was in excellent health and worked his estate harder than any man in the county, which Balfour summoned cheerfully confirmed. He asked delicately whether the Duke did not find the solitude of the place a strain upon the nerves, and Linnet laughed and said she found it the sanest situation she had ever kept house in, and had he seen the improvements to the home farm. He asked, with the sweetest concern, after the child, whom he understood to be delicate, kept much apart. And Linnet had Tilly brought down. That was the master stroke, and she had planned it cold. The little girl came in scrubbed and beribboned and entirely unafraid, made her curtsy to the strange cousin, recited a verse when asked, petted the fat pony's name into the conversation, and climbed without ceremony into her father's lap, where she sat playing with the buttons of his coat while the grown people talked. and the Duke of Blackmere, holding his daughter, looked for 1 hour less like a ghost and more like a man. And there was not a magistrate in England who could have looked at that hearth and called it the den of a lunatic. Gideon Vane understood, by the 3rd hour, that he had lost this particular day. And because he was a patient man, he did not rage. He merely, as he rose to go, allowed the mask to slip the smallest fraction, for her alone to see. "You have done wonders here, Duchess," he murmured, taking her hand again in the hall, while Ambrose saw the horses brought round. "Truly, in so short a time. It is almost enough to make a man forget what this house is, and what my cousin did in it, and how these things always, in the end, come out." He smiled down at her, and his eyes were flat and cold and entirely awake. But a house may be dressed for a single afternoon by a clever woman. The law is not an afternoon. The law is patient and thorough, and it has affidavits, sworn by better men than any groom, and it does not care in the least how prettily the child recites. He pressed her fingers. "I do hope you have not grown too fond of any of this. It would be a pity to grow fond of a thing one is going to lose." Then he was gone down the steps, all warmth again for the watching servants, calling back some pleasantry about the cold. Linnet stood in the doorway and watched his carriage down the drive, and she was not afraid, or not only afraid. She was thinking. Affidavits, he had said. Sworn. He had shown her the shape of his weapon in the pride of his patience, and a weapon whose shape you know is a weapon you may yet turn. She resolved, standing there in the cold, to write to Mr. Dabney, the Duke's solicitor, that very night, and to read with her own eyes every paper Gideon Vane had filed against them. She did not go in at once. Ambrose had come to stand beside her, and he was not looking at the drive. He was looking past it, down the long, white slope of the park, to the tarn. The cold had changed in the night. She felt it now, the different quality of it, the still, deep iron cold that comes before a hard freeze. And down at the bottom of the valley, the black water, which all these weeks had lain open and dark, had begun at its edges to close, a pale rim of new ice creeping out from the shore toward the center. Ambrose had gone the color of the ice. His hand, where it gripped the doorframe, had begun to shake. "Your Grace," Linnet said quietly. But he did not seem to hear her. He was looking at the freezing water, as a man looks at a thing coming for him across a great distance, slowly, and without any hope of being outrun. He was gone from the house by full dark. Linnet knew it the way she had come to know the moods of the place, by a wrongness in the quiet. "Mrs." Prewitt's face when she asked was answer enough, gray and shuttered and old, with a grief that was plainly not new to her. "He goes to the water," the housekeeper said at last, low, "when it freezes. Every year. I send Balfour down to watch that he—" She stopped. "That he does himself no harm by the cold." Then she looked at Linnet, and something in the old woman broke its long habit of silence. "He should not be alone tonight, Your Grace. He has been alone every winter for 4 years, and it has not mended him." "Perhaps." She did not finish. She fetched Linnet's cloak instead, and the good lantern, and she opened the door. The night was still and enormous and bitterly clear, the stars hard as chips of salt, the snow squeaking underfoot. Linnet went down through the white park with the lantern throwing its small gold circle, and she found him at the water's edge, where the new ice began, standing with no coat against the killing cold, staring out across the pale sheet at the black open eye still unfrozen at its center. She did not rush at him. She had learned, from a horse in the dark, how to come to a creature that was past reason. She set the lantern down in the snow a little way off, so the light should not startle. She came the last of the way slowly, and she stopped an arm's length from him, and she did not touch him, and she did not tell him to come inside, and she did not offer him one word of pity. She said, "It was here." It was not a question, and he did not treat it as one. "Rosamond," he said. The name came out of him cracked and terrible, a name he had plainly not spoken aloud in years, and having spoken it once, he could not seem to stop. And the whole of it came then, there at the frozen edge, in that ruined whisper, while the cold burned their faces and the stars wheeled overhead. She had been unhappy, he said. He had married her young, for her beauty, and because it was expected, and he had not understood, until it was far too late to mend, that there was a wildness and a darkness in her that no husband and no house and no fine name could reach. She had hated Blackmere. She had hated the moor and the cold and the distance, and most of all, she had hated the black water below the house, and she could not leave it alone. She rode out on the ice. Every winter, as it froze, she rode Vesper out onto the tarn in the dark, further each time, daring it. And every winter he had raged at her and forbidden it, and set men to watch her. And every winter she had laughed and gone again, because the danger was the only thing in all that country that made her feel alive. The last night they had quarreled, he would not say of what. She had gone down to the stable in her thin slippers, in a fury, and taken the horse, and ridden out onto the new ice further than she had ever dared, out toward the black center where the water never truly froze. And he had come after her. He had heard the ice, and he had run, and he had gone out onto it after her, calling her name, and the ice had given way beneath them both. He did not describe it. Linnet was glad afterward that he did not, and she never asked. He said only that the horse had come out, that Vesper had fought his way back onto the solid ice and up the bank and stood screaming on the shore, and had feared the water like death ever since, because a horse remembers, and that he, Ambrose, had come out too, at the last, dragged half dead and bleeding into the snow by Balfour, who had followed the screaming down the hill. And that Rosamond hadn't come out at all. The wound at his throat he had taken on the broken ice, a great jagged shard of it, in the thrashing dark, reaching for a hand he could not find. It had very nearly finished him, and there were long months, he said, when he could not speak and could not sleep, and could not stop seeing the white shape going down under the black. And when the whole county, fed by a cousin who saw his chance, had decided among themselves that the silent, scarred Duke standing at his drowned wife's grave had put her there himself. He had let them believe it. That was the part he could not forgive, he said. When his voice came back, such as it was, he had never once stood up and denied it, never written to a paper, never called out a single man who whispered, because some cold, drowned part of him had decided that a man who could not save his own wife deserved to wear her death upon his name like the scar upon his throat. He had shut the gates and dismissed the county and let the story harden around him like ice, and had told himself it was justice when it was only grief wearing the mask of justice, which was a thing Linnet knew a very great deal about. "I did not kill her," he whispered, "but I have never once believed I did not fail her. I could not reach her. All my life, everyone I have tried to keep, I have failed to reach." He turned to Linnet at last, and his face in the starlight was wet and open and utterly without defense. "Do you see now why I told you that you might leave? I am not being noble, Linnet. I am a coward. I would rather open the door myself than stand one more time at the edge of the water and watch someone He could not finish it. Linnet stepped forward into the arm's length she had kept, and she did what she had not let herself do at the horse's stall, or in the firelit chamber, or at any moment in all these weeks of careful patience. She reached up, and she laid her bare, cold hand along the scarred side of his face, over the ruin of him, and she held it there. "Most things can be waited out," she said, her voice shaking, "if a body is only stubborn enough to stay. I told you that in the stable yard, and I will tell you now, and you may pay a physician to disagree with me if you like. She is not the water, your grace. I am not the water, and I am not going out onto any ice, and I am not going down, and I am not going anywhere at all, because I am the most stubborn creature you will ever be fool enough to keep, and I have decided to stay, and you cannot open a door wide enough to be rid of me. Do you hear me? I have decided." He made a sound that was half a sob and half her name, and he turned his face into her cold palm, and the Duke of Blackmere, who had stood alone at the edge of that water every winter for 4 years, let himself be led away from it at last, by the hand, back up through the white park, toward the light. In the kitchen, which was the warmest room in the house, she sat him in the great chair by the range, and did the plain, useful things her hands knew, because she had learned long ago that grief cannot be argued with, but it can sometimes be outlasted by ordinary kindness. She built up the fire. She warmed a blanket and wrapped it round his shoulders. She heated milk with a little brandy in it, and folded his cold hands about the cup, and did not let go until his fingers stopped their shaking. She did not tell him it would be well. She did not tell him it had not been his fault, for he would not have believed her, and a truth flung too soon at a wound only makes it close over harder. She simply stayed, and was ordinary, and was warm, and was there, until the worst of the shaking went out of him, and something looser and more human came into his face. "You are not afraid of me," he said at last, wonderingly, as though it were the strangest turn in all that hard night. "Everyone is afraid of me. I have handled worse-tempered creatures than you, your grace," she said, and had the deep satisfaction of watching the ghost of a smile move across his mouth, the first she had ever put there. That night, for the first time in 4 years, he slept, and the door between their rooms stood open, and neither of them locked it. The papers came from Mr. Dabney within the week, a thick packet of them tied in tape, and Linnet took them into the study and did not come out for 2 days. This was the work she had been born for, though no one had ever thought to let her do it. Her father had taught her that a lie, whether in a horse or a ledger, always leaves a mark somewhere for the patient eye, some small place where the false thing fails to match the true. Gideon's petition was a beautiful lie, elegant and thorough, and Linnet went through it line by line with a fresh quill and a cold heart, and on the second day she found the mark. The whole edifice of the thing rested upon a single sworn affidavit, the deposition of an eminent physician of York, a Dr. Meridew, attesting under oath that he had attended the Duke of Blackmere, examined him thoroughly, and found him raving, delusional, and unfit to govern himself or any other soul. It was dated the 11th of November. It was the keystone. Pull it, and the arch fell. Linnet read the date 4 times, because something in it had snagged, some small, cold catch at the back of her orderly mind. And then she rose and went to the long shelf where the old news sheets were kept for the lighting of fires, and she found the York paper for the autumn, and she turned the brittle pages with steady hands until she found it. A notice, edged in black. Dr. Everard Meridew, the eminent physician, mourned by his colleagues, dead of an apoplexy on the 3rd of October. Dr. Meridew had been 5 weeks in his grave on the day he swore he had examined the Duke. Linnet sat down slowly in Ambrose's great chair and let out a long breath, and for the first time since the black carriage had climbed the ridge, she smiled with her whole heart. A dead man cannot examine a duke. A dead man cannot swear an oath. Someone had bought a dead man's name and a dead man's seal and forged the beam the whole house hung from. And forgery of a sworn instrument was not a family disagreement to be settled with lawyers and time. It was a crime. It was the sort of crime that ended a man. Now she needed only to prove whose crime, and for that she did not have long to wait, because Gideon Vane, secure in his patience, had made one further error. He had come too cheaply. A forged deposition, a bribed clerk, a campaign of years, all of it cost money. More money than a mild younger cousin waiting on a title could command. And Lynette had learned in her father's ruin exactly what it looks like when a man is spending someone else's purse. Among the papers Dabney had gathered was the record of the fees already paid into the suit, and the bank that stood behind them, and the name upon the account was not Vane at all. It was Krell, Josiah Krell, who had wanted her and been refused, and had smiled his flat brown smile, and said that these things always came out in the end. He had not forgotten her. He had merely found a longer road to the same house. If Gideon took Blackmere, Krell held Gideon, the way he had held her father, the way he held everyone in the end. And somewhere in the arithmetic of it, she did not doubt, was a clause that delivered the Mad Duke's inconvenient widow back into his soft white hands. They came together in the end, which spared everyone a good deal of trouble. It was a raw, bright morning in March when the two carriages came up the drive, and Lynette watched them come from the study window with the packet of papers squared upon the desk before her, and her heart beating slow and hard and steady. Gideon descended from the first, smooth and smiling, with a lawyer and a commissioner in tow, come to serve his petition in form, and from the second, heavy and unhurried, in a coat too young for him and a great gold watch chain, came Josiah Krell, who had not been able at the last to keep himself away from the harvest. They were shown into the hall, the whole cold-faced procession of them, and Ambrose stood to receive them with Lynette at his side, and Gideon got no further than his first honeyed sentence of regret before Lynette stepped forward and laid Dr. Meridew's affidavit upon the hall table between them, face up, beside the black-edged notice of his death. "Your case, Mr. Vane," she said pleasantly, "rests upon the sworn word of a man who had been dead 5 weeks on the day he is here made to swear it." She let that sit in the ringing silence. "That is not an affidavit. That is a forgery. And forgery of a deposition is a hanging felony, or transportation at the kindest, and it is witnessed now by your own lawyer, your own commissioner, and a magistrate I have taken the liberty of inviting, who is at this moment enjoying my seed cake in the next room." Gideon's smooth face did not so much fall as simply stop, all its pleasant machinery ceasing at once. The lawyer took one long step away from him, the particular step of a professional man declining to drown with a client. "And as for who bought the dead man's oath," Lynette went on, turning now, at last, with real pleasure, to the heavy figure by the door. "We need not wonder. Need we, Mr. Krell? For you were never able to resist paying for a thing with your own name upon the draft." She laid the bank record down beside the rest. "I did warn you once that I keep good accounts. You ought to have believed me." Josiah Krell looked at the papers on the table, and then at Lynette, and his flat brown eyes at last showed something that was almost respect and entirely hatred. "You clever little—" "That will do," said the Duke of Blackmere. He did not shout. He had never, in all the time Lynette had known him, needed to shout, and his whisper, in that frozen hall, carried like a blade drawn slow across stone. He stepped forward, and though he was thinner and grayer and more ruined than any man in that room, every soul in it drew back from him, because there is a thing in a man who has already lost everything and survived it that richer, safer men can never face. "You came into my house," he whispered, "to call me mad, and to take my daughter, and to hand my wife to this creature like a debt discharged. He looked at them, one to the other. Gideon white, Creel gray. You have forged the king's oath, and you have been caught at it before witnesses of your own choosing. The magistrate will have those papers within the hour. My solicitor will have the rest before the assizes. He paused. You wished the world to know the truth of Blackmere. It shall. Every last word of it. Now get out of my house and pray that transportation is all that waits for you. For if either of you comes within sight of my daughter, again while I live, no court in England will be troubled to try me for what I do. I have already been hanged in the county's mouth for one thing I did not do. I find I no longer greatly fear being justly accused of another. They went. There was nothing else in the world for them to do. The lawyer went first and fastest, and the commissioner after, and Gideon Vane went white and silent and forever stripped of his pleasant smile. And Josiah Krell went last, heavy and slow, pausing only at the door to look back once at Lynette, with a look that should have frightened her, and did not, because she had at last, after all these years, more power in that hall than he did, and they both knew it. The great door shut, the bolt went home, and the house was theirs. She thought, in the quiet that followed, that everything was won. She was wrong, though the thing that remained was of a gentler and more dangerous kind. For 3 days Ambrose was a man remade. The shadow that had hung on him lifted, and he laughed twice, and he took Tilly up before him on the quiet gray, and rode the boundary in the pale spring sun, and he sat with Lynette over the estate books in the evenings, with his shoulder a hand's breadth from hers, and the house, for the first time in years, felt less like a grave and more like a beginning. She caught him, on the second of those days, standing at the foot of the stairs beneath the shrouded portrait, looking up at the shape of the cloth as though he meant at last to lift it. She had come and stood beside him and taken his hand and said nothing, and after a while he had let out a long breath and led her away, not ready yet, but no longer afraid of the not being ready. That was new. For 4 years he had been a man frozen at a single instant of his life, and now, hour by hour, he was thawing forward into time again. And Lynette found she could have watched it forever, the slow return of a man from under the ice. And then, on the 4th evening, he offered her the door again. She had known, somehow, that he would. It was the flaw and the glory of him, that terrible aching honor, and she saw it gathering in him all through dinner before he found the courage for it. And she let him find it, because she had learned that a walled-up man must open his own doors. "The suit is broken," he said at last, into the fire, not looking at her. "Krell is finished. Gideon is finished. Tilly is safe, and will stay safe, and the estate is secure, and your sister's portion was always beyond their reach." He turned his glass slowly in his scarred hand. "Which means that the thing I married you for is done. You have paid it in full, and more than I had any right to ask of any living soul." He drew the breath she had come to know, the one that cost him. "So I must tell you again, Lynette, what I told you on the night we wed. You are free. There is nothing left to hold you here. You may have the dower house, or the income and the wide world, and my name to keep you safe in it, and my gratitude to the end of my life." He said it very low. "You may leave if you wish, and this time there is no danger left to make you stay." The fire cracked, and Lynette, who had faced down a moneylender and a forger and a savage horse and a frozen tarn without flinching, felt her eyes fill, because this, at last, was the one thing that could wound her, and he had done it without knowing, which was worse. "Is that what you want?" she said, and her voice was not steady at all. For me to go. No, he whispered instantly, helplessly, before honor could stop him. God, no. And then, wretchedly, having betrayed himself. But what I want is not the thing that matters. What I want has drowned everyone who ever gave it to me. I have watched you these 3 days making this ruin into a home, gentling the horse, saving the child, routing men who would have broken me. And I have thought every hour that I would sooner die than lose you, and that is exactly why I must open the door. Do you not see it? Everyone I let myself keep, I fail. I would rather give you the whole world, freely, than take you and be the death of one more thing I love. There it was. The word, at last, fallen between them like a stone into still water. He looked stricken to have said it, as though it had escaped a locked room and could not be called back, and he did not, in the end, try. Say it was a slip, his eyes seemed to beg her. Say it, and I will open the door and let you go and never speak of it again. Give me back the safe grief I know how to carry. Lynette stood. She crossed to him, and she took the glass from his hand and set it down. And she took his ruined face between both her hands as she had at the water's edge, and she made him look at her. Now you listen to me, she said, fierce and low, the way you would not let me listen at the tarn. You did not fail her because you loved her. She was not drowned by your wanting, and I am not a thing that will slip out of your keeping the moment you let yourself hold it. I am not Rosamond. I do not want the ice. I want the fire, and the ledgers, and the fat pony, and the child, and the horse, and the whole cold, beautiful ruin of this place. And I want you, Ambrose. You, not the safety of you, and not the freedom from you. And I have wanted the whole of it since I knelt in the straw, and that poor mad horse laid his head in my hand. And I understood that everything in this house was only waiting for someone stubborn enough not to leave. She was weeping now and did not care. You keep offering me a door. I am telling you for the last time, I do not want the door. I want to bolt it from the inside and lose the key. You cannot mean it, he whispered, but he was already reaching for her, his honor losing at last the long war it had waged against his heart. No one has ever. He could not finish it. There were a great many sentences, Lynette was learning, that this man had gone 4 years without needing to complete, because there had been no one left in all the world he trusted to complete them to. For a long moment he only looked at her, this woman who would not drown, and would not leave, and would not, whatever he offered, be got rid of. Then the Duke of Blackmere stopped being noble. He pulled her against him, ruined throat and shaking hands and 4 years of grief, and he kissed her, and it was nothing like the chaste dead handclasp of their wedding. It was a man coming up at last, out of black water into air, desperate and whole and alive. And Lynette, who had been given away all her life and had that night given herself, freely of her own stubborn choosing, kissed him back and held on, and did not let go. In the morning, before the household was up, he took her by the hand and led her to the shrouded portrait on the stair, and together they drew off the holland cloth, and Lynette looked for the first time on the face of the beautiful, unhappy woman who had come before her, and did not hate her, and did not fear her. And then Ambrose took the great ring of keys, and he walked to the shut east wing, and he unlocked the door that had not been opened in 4 years, and he let the cold grief out of it, and the morning light in, and he did not once look back. They aired the shut rooms that week, and took down the black. And by summer, the east wing held a chamber for Wren, and a schoolroom for Tilly, and a long, bright gallery where a child could run the length of the house, shrieking. And if the ghost of a beautiful, unhappy woman lingered anywhere in it, she seemed to Lynette content enough, at last, to rest, now that the house above her had finally chosen to go on living. They were married again in June, which is to say they were married in truth, for the first time, by their own choosing, in the little chapel at the edge of the east garden, with the door standing open to the summer. It was not the same as the first time, and everything about it was a quiet answer to that cold, candlelit bargain. There were flowers this time, whole armfuls of them, more cotton and dog rose, and the first foxgloves, gathered by Tilly, who strewed them up the aisle with tremendous solemnity, and one shoe missing. There was music, for the village had come, all of it. The same village that had once whispered murder, filing in shy and curious, and then, seeing the Duke smile, warming. Because a county will forgive a great deal of a man it has wronged if he gives it the chance to feel generous. Mrs. Prewitt wept openly and denied it fiercely. Balfour gave the bride away, scrubbed to a shine, and prouder than any earl. The vicar who married them was the same thin, frightened man who had joined their cold bargain in the winter, and he was not frightened now. He stumbled over none of the words, and when he came to the part where he asked whether any person present knew cause why these two should not be joined together, a small silence fell, and every soul in that chapel remembered the whispers of 4 long winters. And then Balfour said, loud and flat into the quiet, "None whatever," and the whole village laughed, and the last of the old poison went out of the room like breath on a cold morning, and did not come back. And Wren came. She came up from the south in a hired chaise with a new bonnet and a year's worth of growing done, a girl no longer, brimming with the safety her sister had bought her, and she flung herself upon Linnet in the chapel yard, and cried, and laughed, and could not stop talking, and Linnet held her thin, strong sister in her arms, and understood, fully for the first time, the size of what she had won by climbing into that black carriage in the rain. Not a title, not a rescue. A life with everyone she loved alive inside it, and no soft white hand anywhere near the door. Wren would stay the summer, and many summers after, and grow up half at Blackmere among the horses and the moor wind, and become in time a young woman with a fortune of her own, and the freedom to spend it precisely as she pleased, which was the truest revenge Linnet could imagine upon the memory of the man who had once counted her sister as an opportunity. Of Josiah Krell and Gideon Vane, the county spoke for a season, and then, as counties do, moved on to fresher scandal. Krell was found to have forged more than one instrument in his long climb, and a man with that much money and that many enemies, once the fear of him cracks, does not stay standing long. He lost the greater part of his fortune to the lawyers, and the rest to the shame, and ended in a small house in a wet town, and no one who had ever owed him a farthing sent so much as a card. Gideon Vane fled to the continent one step ahead of the assizes, and was not heard from again, the title still, in the end, hopelessly beyond his reach, for Ambrose, as it happened, and to the vast surprise of the entire medical profession, proved a long way from dying. And the news of it all reached London at last, as such news does, and the town that had shuddered so deliciously over the mad Duke of Blackmere and his drowned bride, discovered that it had, all along, and rather against its will, been reading a love story. The following spring, Linnet Vane sat on an upturned pail in the stable yard, in the last blue light, and watched her husband try to teach their daughter to ride the black horse. Vesper was an old gentleman now, gray coming in around his soft, dark muzzle, and he stood like a rock, while Tilly perched on his broad back in a state of shrieking delight, and Ambrose walked at his head, with one hand on the rein he did not truly need, whispering to the horse in the low, rough voice that the horse, alone of all creatures, had never seemed to find broken. The tarn lay flat and silver below them in the evening, holding the last of the light, and no one in that yard wasn't the least afraid of it anymore, for it was only water, and the winter was a long way off. And even the winter had lost its teeth. Lynette thought, watching them, of the woman who had climbed into a black carriage 2 winters gone, a single trunk and a signed bargain to her name, riding north to a stranger, the whole world called a murderer, certain she was going to her grave. She thought of a cold, fire-lit room and a broken whisper telling her she might leave if she wished, and the strangest thing she had ever done, which was to look a wide-open door in the face and choose, of her own free will, to stay. Everyone had told her it was madness. Perhaps it had been. She had never in her life made a wiser choice. "Papa," cried Tilly, "sit me higher." And Ambrose looked over the old horse's back at his wife and smiled the smile that had once seemed impossible on that ruined face. And Lynette smiled back, and the light held and held, and the door of Blackmere stood open behind them to let the warm evening in. If Lynette and Ambrose, finding their way to one another, out of all that cold and grief, has left you with a fullness in your chest, then you know exactly why we tell these stories. There is nothing in the world quite like watching 2 broken people become, together, the safe place neither of them ever had. If this tale moved you, please tap the like button. It truly does help the channel more than you know. Tell me in the comments which moment stayed with you: the frozen water, the horse in the straw, or the door he could not stop offering and she would not walk through. And if you would like to sit by the fire with us again, do subscribe and ring the bell, so the next story finds you the moment it is told. Until then, be warm, be stubborn, and stay.